Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp here. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with Dr. Amy L. Sherman. Growing up here in the South, I learned early that there are certain subjects one ought never raise in polite company, namely money, politics, and religion. No surprise then that I ended up as a theology and ethics professor with a podcast and a public radio show in which we regularly discuss all three and in broad public. On No Small Endeavor, we've decided not to shy away from public theology, though it's no doubt a fraught endeavor. It's challenging, obviously, in our day and time, given the rising secularism among many and the rising forms of Christian nationalism among many others. Doing the work of public theology, though, assumes that bringing religious and theological commitments to bear upon conversation in the public square may, in fact, make a great contribution to the public good. Many avowed secularists, obviously, may find this a distasteful presumption. On the other hand, public theology often presumes that there's something about specific theological commitments that may be voiced in a way that honors the shared goods of our communities, even if the specific theological commitments are not shared, or even outright rejected. Many proponents of particular religious commitments may find this a distasteful presumption. All that to say this: we never engage in conversations around public theology lightly, while insisting upon the importance, maybe even the necessity, of having such conversations, such as that exemplified by our guest today, Dr. Amy L. Sherman. She articulates a public theology committed to the common good that exemplifies a robust, practical vision of community engagement and collective flourishing. Here's our unabridged interview with Dr. Amy L. Sherman. Enjoy. Welcome, Amy.
Thanks so much for having me, Lee.
Pleasure to have you with us. Nice to see you again. And thank you for your book. I think that as you make the case in Agents of Flourishing that Christian faith ought to be invested in every facet of human life, including things like economic development, aesthetics, urban development, education, sustainability, I think this kind of claim will surprise many people, and I think it will surprise many Christians and non-Christians alike, for at least one reason being that so often religion, we might put that in scare quotes, religion is thought to be a matter that's primarily concerned with some notion of the afterlife rather than a matter of public concern. So maybe first talk to us about why you want to hold faith together with such concerns.
Yeah, well, I think an accurate reading of the scriptures shows us that God has a comprehensive concern for the world that he made. If we think about kind of the great meta-narrative of scripture, it begins with a world marked by what the Hebrews called shalom, which is this really rich word that gets translated into English as the word peace, but that really doesn't capture the fullness of it. Shalom means peace with God, so spiritual wholeness, peace with self, psychological wholeness, peace with others, social wholeness, peace with the created order itself, physical wholeness, a world, in other words, of flourishing, of the flourishing of the human person and the flourishing of relationships among human persons, the flourishing of humanity in this created world that God made. And the story begins that way. And then, unfortunately, as we know, we lose a lot of that in what theologians call the fall of man. And but the end of the biblical story kind of reiterates this vision of shalom, of a restored shalom, that in this broken world where instead of psychological wholeness, we have alienation, instead of social peace and harmony, we have all kinds of warfare and violence and conflicts. But the end of the biblical narrative is about a restored shalom. So if that's the big story that God is telling and that God is causing to happen in the world, then how can we, as the followers of God, not share that broad understanding of how God wants this shalom, this flourishing in every corner of human endeavor and human existence? So what we care about as Christians who take the Bible seriously, if that is your faith, it's a pretty broad view.
I can imagine as some folks getting skittish about your proposal from the start, from the perspective of we see in our own day, and we see throughout the history of Western civilization, ways in which Christian faith was used to justify all sorts of damaging impositions of a sort of faith upon a public that didn't want that kind of imposition. To put it more bluntly, I can imagine some people thinking, look, keep your grubby little Christian hands off of education and off of urban planning. And so
Right.
I would imagine you might get some of that. So how do you respond to that?
Yeah. Well, if the first concern you raised was about, in a sense, an understanding of what religious people are doing in the world being way, way too narrow and very too much sort of ephemerally focused on this ethereal afterlife, and it doesn't really have a whole lot to do, faith doesn't have a whole lot to do with the world. This second concern that you're raising is also something that has to be engaged with, because the church has made a whole lot of mistakes in history, and the current situation in the church is far, far, far from perfect. And it's interestingly, one of the motivations for writing Agents of Flourishing came as a result of me having a conversation with a relative of mine who is not a Christian and who has very vocal criticisms of what the church has done in history, and as well as contemporary criticisms of actions today. And so we have to be honest about that history. But what I encountered in my conversation with her was a lot of ignorance around the contributions that Christianity has made, and that Christ followers throughout history have made to the flourishing of the world. And so our grubby little hands have been on all the various sectors of society. And in fact, they ended up building some beautiful things. Christianity has been a force for social justice. It has been a seedbed of beautiful art and music. It has been a champion of the vulnerable and the builder of institutions to care for the vulnerable. That there's a very rich history here of Christians who understood this vision of flourishing and sought to bring some foretastes of that sort of heavenly vision here on earth. And we've made all kinds of mistakes along the way. And we have been guilty of bringing harms. However, we have also been the source of an incredible amount of contribution to flourishing throughout history and even now today. And I wanted to tell those stories.
Yeah. Yeah, it does seem to me that as the sort of theological illiteracy, the rise of increasing theological illiteracy in the Western world keeps us from knowing some of the history that you're pointing to there. And I think, for example, you point several times in your book to the theological notion of the image of God. Throughout Scripture, there's this notion of humankind being created in the image of God, and that this somewhat simple claim nonetheless has had profound social impact. So maybe unpack some of that as an example of a way in which a sort of theological construct can have such profound social implications.
Yeah. Well, when we think about things like human rights, the image of God concept reminds us that because of this inherent human dignity, we have to honor that in our treatment of one another. And so it really is a foundation for our understanding of human rights. And the concept of the image of God in the earliest years of the church had some really interesting implications for sort of resisting the way that the Roman Empire viewed women, viewed children, viewed people who were guilty of committing crimes. There was a way in which children were not necessarily seen as persons, at least until they reached a certain age. And so you had strange, what to us would feel like strange customs of children not being valued, children not necessarily being parented by their parents. In the wealthier classes, sort of you subcontracted that out to somebody else up to a certain age, as well as really horrific child abuses and leaving infants out to die from exposure. So you didn't have a robust sense of sort of the human rights of children. And then in terms of women at the time of the very early church in its earliest centuries, again, were sort of less than persons. If you weren't a male and you weren't a Roman citizen, you weren't treated with that sort of dignity. So a widow, for example, once her husband dies, she's not able to inherit any of that property. Women were at the whim of Roman male citizens who could really be sexual predators without restraint and without legal condemnation. So that doctrine of the Imago Dei begins to say, no, wait a minute, we have to think differently about what a child is, what a woman is, in a way that was really quite countercultural. And then similarly with those who had broken the law, there was a practice of face branding. So criminals would literally be branded with a fire iron to be marked on their faces as criminals. And the early church advocated against that practice on the basis of the doctrine of the Imago Dei. Yes, you may have broken the law, but you are still a human person, and you should not be subject to that kind of treatment. And they honored women, and they honored widows, and they rescued children and adopted children. So it wasn't just that they were speaking in the public square, here's a different way of thinking about these things. They backed that up with some very important practices to embody those convictions.
You discuss what you call six endowments, realms of gift, concern, system structures that we encounter in human life. And these are the good, the true, the beautiful, the just, the prosperous, and the sustainable. And then you point to ways in which faith communities could have a sort of larger imagination with regard to each of these. And in beginning to get into that conversation, you suggest that while it's all fine and good to clean up a local park or paint a school, that those are relatively shallow concerns compared to what you're envisioning?
Yeah, that's right. If we take this vision of shalom, this vision of holistic flourishing really seriously, and believe that it is central to the mission of the church in the world to be agents of flourishing, then it's not like it's a bad idea to do these sort of episodic, one-off, compassion Sundays of cleaning up the park or whatever. But there's a disconnect between sort of that level of activity and this very, very intensive and extensive vision of flourishing. And what I argue in the book is not necessarily that every church has to make some grandiose contribution to all of those 6 realms that you were just mentioning. Most churches are relatively small. They're under 100 people. And they don't necessarily have, tons of money. So I'm not suggesting that each church is responsible to accomplish sort of vast things. But what I am saying is that our imagination ought to be very robust and ought to have in mind real transformation. Right. Not the Band-Aid stuff, not the short-term commodity-based stuff. The deeper relational, ongoing, longer emphasis sorts of works, which may mean that it would be, in my view, wiser for a church to do less. Right? Why have 5 different programs, each of which are only 2 inches deep? And instead say, wow, the vision here is really big. We can't do it all, but we could maybe make a bit of a real impact on a small number of people if we focused our efforts, concentrated on sort of one thing and went deeper and for a longer period of time. And that's the kind of shift that I would like to see. Many churches are involved in their community in one way or another. Some of the research talks about, 85% of churches are doing something. But a lot of what they're doing is the more short-term, episodic stuff. And if we believe that this is the vision for human flourishing, then we ought to be willing to rethink some of those more episodic activities and look for something deeper and more sustainable.
Yeah. Well, let's dig into some of those examples of some of those. So the first 3 so-called endowments that you point to is a traditional notion of the so-called transcendentals in the Christian tradition, the good, the true, the beautiful.
Right.
But let's talk, for example, about the true a moment. And it strikes me that oftentimes discussions of truth will quickly devolve into greater animosity and partisanship because people quickly begin to argue about, well, what is true, right? But you seem to be suggesting that to honor the truth from the particular perspective of faith, that we're trying to find a way to get into some sort of truth that serves a common good. And so a sort of eager engagement, for example, in the goods of public education or children's literacy rates. So maybe unpack some of that, of how you see that that pursuit of the truth being a pursuit that serves the common good.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that in the Christian worldview, there's a a great delight in and conviction about the importance of the life of the mind. That there's a recognition that a Christian understanding of human nature means that we embrace our DNA as curious people, as people who are actually built to learn, right? We don't show up as babies knowing it all. We actually think education's pretty important. And, it's kind of crazy, and I reflect on this a little bit in the book. It's kind of crazy, really, when you think about God coming to earth as a baby and God, through Jesus, having to be a learner, having to be an explorer, a discoverer. That's one of the many ways in which the incarnation is mind-boggling. So we have to take education really seriously. We have to take it seriously because it comes out of what we understand human nature to actually be. We are intellectual beings. We are relational beings, which means we desire communication. Well, you can't have communication if you don't learn languages, if you don't become literate, etc. And we're built to be these explorers and investigators and discoverers. So we have to embrace the importance of education. And then when you think about that from a perspective of justice, you want to say, well, if all humans are built that way, then education should be for all. And we should really care about educational equity and making sure that lots of people, all people, have this opportunity to live into their own human nature and develop the life of the mind. And so because of that, in the book, although there are many valid ways for churches to be engaged in what is termed there the realm of the true, this realm of human learning and knowledge, many ways that we can be validly involved. I particularly push the idea of churches supporting public schools out of this conviction around educational equity and the desire for all children and students to have the opportunity to grow in these ways. And so it was fun finding, a variety of examples of ways that churches are engaged with public schools. There are examples of, there's a group called Caring for Kids out in Kansas City, and what they're all about is sitting down with the principals of schools that are serving the more lower income students, and sort of saying to the principals, what are your dreams and visions? What are your big goals? And how might community members, including people from the faith community, how might they come alongside the school and help advance some of your vision? So I write about that organization. And I also write about some churches that have basically said, we want to bolster what's happening in the life of public school students by coming alongside them after school, paying attention to what they're getting in the school day and what they're not getting in the school day, and seeing, can we come along with some extra activities and curriculum that kind of fills in the gaps. And I write about a wonderful church in Pittsburgh called Bible Center Church that has a very vibrant program that especially leans into the sciences, because what they've realized is their local public schools, for a whole variety of reasons and shortcomings of resources, the kids aren't getting as much science education. So those are some of the ways that churches are, I think, leaning into that conviction that education is really important and it's important for all, and therefore let's bolster our public schools.
I have, because of a group here in Nashville that I'm big fans of, became aware a number of years ago of the correlation in studies between things like fourth grade literacy rates and the demand that there will be for prisons, and that the higher the degree of illiteracy, the higher the demand for prisons. And it's such troubling, that's a deeply troubling correlation.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so I find this quite compelling, the vision that you're sketching here of saying, surely there are things here that we can all agree on, and that we can then say, with all of our abundance and resources and knowledge, surely we can do something to help these sorts of realities come out to different and better outcomes.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And there's so many really wonderful stories of what that looks like when it takes shape. I don't talk about this in the book, but I'm a real fan of a group called Elevate USA, and then they have chapters in a variety of cities across the country. And they basically partner with the public schools and put into the public school a teacher mentor, who serves, in a sense, pro bono, because the nonprofit pays their salary, in high schools, to really focus on what can we do about keeping kids from dropping out. And they've had tremendous success in reducing high school dropout.
What do you do personally with the sort of tension that seems manifest in this description of the true, in that we have on the one hand, and you point to this in your book, in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, a sort of crucial contributions to human learning, scientific method, all sorts of discovery that happens in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment from the Christian tradition. And then on the other hand, we also have this stubborn, persistent strand of anti-intellectualism that wants to kind of discard scientific discovery and act as if any sort of intellectual life of the mind is a threat to faith. What do you do with that kind of tension yourself?
Well, I think what I do with it is try to resist that anti-intellectual strain. I think, based on all the stuff I just said earlier, that is not the appropriate posture. It's not the appropriate posture because God has created this world and invited us to engage with it intellectually. And he's made us people with minds that are to be stewarded well for not just worship of him, but stewarded well for the task of love of neighbor. And part of loving your neighbor is caring about their education. So I think we have to just sort of keep going back to basic theological conversations within the religious community to make arguments around the need for being enthusiastic about creative endeavors and intellectual curiosity and seeking knowledge, rather than being afraid to do that, or thinking somehow that we have to just sort of remind everybody, like, God made the whole world. There is quote unquote secular knowledge, i.e., in other words, God didn't just. We don't live in a world where all we have is God as this sort of transcendent being and then nothing else. We have this world that he's created, and investigating, exploring, pursuing knowledge about his world is one important way of celebrating and worshiping God for what he has created.
Another one of the 6 endowments you point to is the beautiful, and with the pointing us to this notion that beauty, aesthetics, and here you include things like urban planning alongside art and architecture, that these are key pursuits with regard to human flourishing. To unpack some of that for us.
Well, there's such a long tradition of Christian thinkers recognizing that God is not only the good and the true, but God is actually beauty. God is the source of beauty. God is beauty in God's being. So there's a celebration of that, I think, in the truest strains of our theological history. There's a celebration of the beauty of God, and there's a recognition that the creation is beautiful, that it's beautiful in a way that's kind of profligate. That it's, do we really need, I don't know how many species of birds we have. I think it's probably a lot. It's probably more than like 25 or 50 or 100. Well, one of the reasons that exists is God wants to say, I can make a million different beautiful birds, each of which has its own unique forms of beauty. And so there's this sort of profligacy in creation that I think is an expression both of the abundance that is part of sort of God's being, but also the beauty that is God's being. And I think it's not that hard to argue that God loves beauty and delights in beauty and actually encourages human beings to be engaged in aesthetic endeavor, in the building of the tabernacle in the Jewish Old Testament. There's all these instructions to the craftsmen, quite detailed instructions about building a structure that was not just sort of functional, but also very, very beautiful. And again, just sort of arguing from the idea of human nature, what happens when human beings encounter beauty? Well, there is wonder, there is delight, there is often a sort of form of worship. Even the person who doesn't believe in God, it's a window into sort of something that they might even use the word transcendent. And if they don't, they still want to say, they want to call up their friend and say, I'm experiencing this beautiful thing and I want you to participate. It's like they're being evangelists, right? So beauty, beauty can be cathartic, it can be healing, it can be worshipful, it can be awe-inspiring. Beauty, it's just not hard from an argument of human nature. Obviously, beauty really, 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 really matters. And it was fun for me in the parts of the book where I reflect on church history to kind of discover and rediscover the ways in which the church has embodied that conviction about the importance of beauty by actually being patrons of the arts.
I was fascinated with a 2012 study you cited that indicated the importance of urban beauty upon human happiness. And I think a lot of us don't think much about urban planning and our notions of happiness or flourishing. But what did you learn about that, or what sticks out to you of things that you saw people trying to do in that regard?
Yeah. Well, I think that there's a recognition of the importance of place. Again, our understanding of reality is that we are embodied people, and embodied people living in a material, physical environment. And we live in places, distinct places. And we recognize that place does things to people positively and negatively, that the conditions and the aesthetics and the design of place can sort of lift the human spirit or depress the human spirit. And so we see people who follow Jesus Christ, and those who don't, giving really serious attention to this idea of placemaking and the built environment. Are there better and worse ways of sort of designing buildings when it comes to how they will be experienced by human persons? Are there better and less better ways of designing communities and common spaces that are healthier or less healthy? And so place just matters. And again, I don't think if one takes seriously the account of the scriptures, things happen in places. Mm-hmm. And there is a call to make places better. The exiles in Babylon are told, the Jewish exiles who've been carried off to exile in the city of Babylon are actually told to work for the peace and the prosperity and the flourishing of that place. And throughout the Old Testament, we see interesting examples of how place is sort of remembered through rituals, because important things happened in those places. And there's some really practical and interesting parts of the Jewish law in the early books of the Old Testament that relate to kind of how you do placemaking, where you put the refuse, where you build the houses. There's like a design. There's planning that's going on there, because place affects the quality of the human experience.
Yeah, as you were describing those realities, I was flashing in my mind to the way in which the maple tree that's just outside my window that we planted when our boys were young, that's now a very beautiful, quite large maple tree, is so beautiful, and it so grounds us to this place, or the joy that I currently have right now, because last year we put out 4 new compact azaleas with some decorative grasses behind it, with a sumac that's spectacular, with 4 new hydrangeas. I go out every morning and I check on them, and I'm watching them, as they made it through the winter, their first winter, and are now flourishing in this second spring. And I also, you have this beautiful quote from a philosopher, Anthony O'Hearn, I'm not sure, citing this philosopher, Anthony O'Hearn, who said, even in the poorest of circumstances, people have a yearning for beauty and order. And I flashed back to when my wife Laura and I were young marrieds. We spent some time in Nairobi, Kenya, and I had a friend when I was there who came to me one day and said, I want you to come meet some friends of mine. And we were working in a very poor, destitute neighborhood of Nairobi, and he took me out some blocks and turned down an alleyway, and we climbed up over a very 6-foot tall pile of trash, literally, that oozed when you stepped in the wrong place, and then came down on the other side, and there was a little community of street boys, six street boys that were all aged 12 to 18, who were living there in just that destitution. And I got to know them over a number of weeks and months, and And we watched that as they tried to find their own way in the world and this kind of new dislocation that they had experienced. There was this one boy, he must have been 13, 14 years old. And over those months that we were there, when I would come back, I started noticing that he had planted flowers outside this little ramshackle. He was living under a piece of plastic, and yet he wanted some flowers. And so I just think this sort of yearning that we have for beauty is so important and can be such a gift. It's such a gift to ourselves when we receive it, right? And it can be such a gift to our neighbors when we try to find ways to facilitate it communally. So I find that the way you described it very beautiful. But any comments on any of that?
Only to say I've seen the exact same phenomenon. I don't travel internationally now, but I did earlier in my career, and usually to very poor areas, and it was exactly the same experience. Being sort of astounded that in the midst of, quote unquote squalor, any place a person could have something of color, whether it was a rag, whether it was a picture torn out of a magazine. You found that in the most ramshackle of dwellings. Any place where there's any opportunity to have a flower, there would be a flower. Because we not only need food and water, we actually need beauty.
Yeah. You, I didn't find that you discussed this in your book, but obviously we live in a day and age in which STEM in education is kind of the queen of the sciences, if you will. And while I have my own sort of training in STEM as an undergraduate, it seems to me that we're really our own sort of formation is paltry when not getting at the things that you're pointing us to. Beauty, truth, goodness, that might not really get discussed much in an emphasis upon STEM. But comments on that, about the need that we might have to have a more holistic account of human life?
Yeah. Well, as you know, the book is organized around these 6 realms of civilizational life. And it would be a mistake to think of those 6 things as these independent silos, as though there's no kind of dynamic relationship among them. And when we think about something like technology or STEM education, I think what we have to do is kind of bring to bear the values and the emphases about human flourishing that kind of emerge in some of the other other spaces. So thinking about how is a STEM education that's too narrowly construed causing us to fail to ask justice questions. For example, we're gonna learn this new technology, and wow, it's gonna bring all this efficiency. Well, okay, but what are some of the unintended consequences of that? And are we valuing efficiency over human relationships? Are we potentially creating something that reinforces unhealthy power dynamics and thus is not really a just thing to do? Or we have this new scientific innovation. Wonderful. Let's be excited about that. But can we also ask questions around sustainability? Can we ask questions about what might be the implications of that particular innovation on the health of the planet, or on the health of human persons, or on the mental health or emotional health of human persons? So, in other words, this sort of holistic and interrelated understanding of human flourishing invites us to critique and interrogate particular innovations in one of those arenas by the values and convictions that about human flourishing that emerge from the other arenas. And I mean, I am the product of a liberal arts education. I went to a Christian liberal arts college called Messiah College, so I have a particular affection for the liberal arts that is probably shining through here. But I also think that a pursuit of sort of a STEM education unmoored from attentiveness to other dynamics of human flourishing is probably unwise.
You alluded there to the questions of justice as well that we need to raise, and that's one of the 6 endowments or spheres that you discuss. Just talk about that a bit. And again, given our current contemporary social setting, I think this is going to be one of those that some might find counterintuitive, looking upon kind of the arguments that are being had in the Christian tradition, where there seems to be among so many Christians in the United States this sort of hypersensitivity to any kind of discussion about justice, as if that has nothing to do with the Christian tradition. But you're kind of making the case, no, actually, this is central to one of the central themes to the Christian tradition. So
Yes.
begin to unpack some of that for us as well.
Yeah. Well, as you know, that my basic approach in the book is to say, here are these sort of 6 realms, which, by the way, I should give credit very quickly to my buddy Josh Yates and the Thriving Cities Group. I didn't come up with this framework of the 6 endowments. I simply champion it in the book and then use it as the organizing schema for the book. But it was really the Thriving Cities Group that developed that. So as you know, in the book, as I approach each of these 6 endowments, kind of the way that I try to unpack that is to ask some questions about, from the biblical text, what can we infer regarding the sort of creational normativity in that particular realm? And then how do we think about the ways in which that structure has been malformed? So in the realm of justice, for example, we can kind of search the scriptures and see first of all, just such a comprehensive and robust treatment of justice throughout the Old and New Testaments, which belies its obvious importance to God. And then there are many different principles that we can kind of pull out from what we see. So we talked about one earlier, which is the foundational importance of the Imago Dei, the inherent dignity of every human person, and therefore the claims that they have on other people about how they get treated. We also see this sort of relational understanding about justice, that justice is about how I treat others and how they treat me. It's an embodied kind of a thing, and we see concern for the most vulnerable people in the society. And so there's economic laws that the ancient Israelites were supposed to live by. That for example, if you were a farmer and you owned your land, you were to kind of plant and harvest your land, but leave some left over for the poor of the land to come in and glean. So there's all these, really important principles around justice, and one of the overarching kind of themes is this idea of restorative justice. So when it comes to conflicts that have occurred and crimes that have happened, whereby one person has harmed another person or community in some way through violence, through theft, through fraud, etc. How do we going to make that right? And in the biblical vision, the making of it right does involve a degree of a punitive response that you have to kind of pay for what you have done. But it also embeds within it the hope, the possibility of a restored relationship, that through restitution, through repentance, there is this opportunity for the one who has harmed the community to be able to come back into that community. And in the United States, our justice system has more of an emphasis on retributive justice than it does on restorative justice. And I think that one of the greatest contributions Christians can be making is to advocate for, create imagination around, and even design restorative justice kinds of initiatives. And so I actually write in the book about one church up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, that has a whole group of people that have given 30 years of thought and action towards that end. So justice is super important. It's all over the scriptures, and it is a source of great grief and lament to me, honestly, Lee, that we have people of faith who now have sort of a knee-jerk reaction negatively to words like justice or social justice or equity. I think that's a great tragedy.
The contemporary schools of restorative justice have been fascinating to me as well, and you point to some of these, several of these in the book. I think Howard Zehr, who you also mentioned, was my first exposure to the contemporary notion of restorative justice, that sets up a very different model of thinking about how to deal with offenses in our communities, and so that our system of retributive justice and the criminal justice system in the United States is typically sees an offense as an offense against the state as opposed to an offense against a victim, right? And so the victim may or may not get factored into how things get restored, right? And it's more seen as an offense against the state. So there's punishment against the offender to enact some sort of supposed balance of rightfulness with regard to the state. Whereas this restorative justice model you're pointing to says, no, it harms the community. And so the question, and it harms the victim and it harms the community. So then the question becomes, how do we make these things whole? And the sort of beautiful creative possibilities that arise out of that, I just find so remarkable. And I think it's quite helpful in you pointing us to the ways in which I think a lot of times people can look at potential solutions like this and see them as utopian or idealistic, but it's actually a very pragmatic and very practical source of opportunities.
Oh, absolutely. I have my best friend teaches at the University of Virginia Law School, and she has done some special sort of seminars around this concept of restorative justice. And these law students, they sort of eat it up because they that they see that it contains, and most of them are not people of faith, but they see the potential that this sort of paradigm, this sort of approach makes possible, and they're very attracted to it. They're skeptical at times, and but some of the stuff she does is she literally she sort of shows videos of encounters between offenders and victims, and the way that these very emotional kind of cathartic encounters, and they're kind of blown away by it all, but they're sort of pulled. They're pulled to it, and they're pulled to it, like I say, not necessarily out of some, I'm pulled to it in part because of my religious faith. I think they're pulled to it because there's a trueness about it. We are made for wholeness. We are made for relationship. And I think they're attracted to these ideas and these stories because they see the healing and the restoration of community that's happening in that kind of approach versus our very sterile retributive approach. And they don't maybe quite know what to do with it, but their hearts are pulled towards it.
Yeah. So the two of the endowments or spheres that we haven't gotten to yet, business and economics, and or the realm of the sustainable. Maybe you want to pick one of your favorites there and talk about one of those with us as we get near the end.
Yeah. Well, I'm very interested in economic development, about economics in general, and so it was really fun thinking about and writing about the realm of the prosperous, and that involved some theological reflection that I alluded to earlier, just in this, just an awareness of the abundance of God's creation and the profligacy of God's creation. And then we also see this idea that God is a creator. God makes things, God develops things, and then in his image, we also are creators, and we can make new things. And in fact, in the Old Testament, what theologians call the cultural mandate, God inviting human beings to sort of engage with this created order and develop it, bring it to greater flourishing, bring it to greater abundance. And so again, we're made for economic activity. We're made to be creators. We're made to be stewards. We're made to make something of this world that God has given to us. And the scriptures also try to provide some guidance in a fallen world. It's one thing to be in the Garden of Eden and be all excited about getting to make all these things in a world of this great abundance. It's another thing to think about economic life after the introduction of evil and sin and brokenness and corruption into the world. And so economic life becomes a locus of potential violence and injustice. And so there's much wisdom in the scriptures about sort of how to think about business and economic life so that we can advance a modicum, a measure of this flourishing and shalom, despite the fact that we live in situations where we feel scarcity, we recognize brokenness, and the like. And so one of the things I reflect on is a church in Ohio called Grace Chapel, where they have really thought about entrepreneurship and business ownership and what it looks like for that to be a sort of redemptive pursuit. And they have a way of thinking about business and a way of conducting business that are countercultural in certain ways. Although I think this is changing now and has been changing for some time, for a period of time in the United States and in the Western world, sort of the dominant idea around business was what we would call the shareholder kind of perspective, where profit really is the principal aim of the business endeavor. And that contrasts with what folks now call the stakeholder perspective, which says that profit is very important and the shareholders are an important stakeholder in a business. But there are other stakeholders also whose lives are touched by the business, the people that work for the business, the customers of the business, the people that live in the area where the business is located, and the like. And so the folks at Grace Chapel have sort of taken a look at what the scriptures seem to say about economic life and about justice, and have come to the conclusion that a stakeholder perspective is in greater alignment with sort of God's vision for economic life. And so they teach that, they champion that, they muse and argue and wrestle around the ins and outs of all of that. And then they actually try to help business people, particularly entrepreneurs, start new business enterprises that try to embody those various connections about how the business can bring value to the owners and the shareholders, and bring value to the customers, the employers, et cetera, the other stakeholders. And this church, which is not that big, really, I think it may be around 500 plus people. It's relatively large, but it's not a mega church of 10,000 folks. And over the years, they have helped to launch 26 different businesses at home and some abroad. And, they provide coaching, they provide startup capital, they provide kind of ongoing consulting, they provide a lot of support for the business entrepreneurs. And to me, it's a beautiful and wonderful example of embracing this idea that economic life really, really matters. We have to have creative, entrepreneurial action in our community to create new wealth. That's a really important part of human flourishing. But how do we go about doing that? Well, let's go about doing it in this way that thinks about this value for all kind of way of designing those businesses, and it's really neat to go and look and see what they've done, and it's quite a story.
Been talking to Dr. Amy L. Sherman, Senior Fellow at the Sagamore Institute, where she directs the Center on Faith in Communities. We've been discussing her book, Agents of Flourishing. Amy, thanks so much for your time and for your good work, and grateful for the conversation today.
Really appreciate your interest in the book and this opportunity to chat with you today, Lee. Thank you.
Thank you. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carrie Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Audrey Griffith, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studio.